Have you ever spent years, and I mean years, learning a language in a classroom? Memorizing all those vocabulary lists and grammar rules, only to feel completely lost when you're in a real conversation? It's a super common frustration. So today we're going to break down the method behind a popular online English course to figure out how they're tackling this exact problem. Let's see how they're flipping the script on language learning.
Wow, this one quote from a student really just says it all, doesn't it? Real English, not classroom English. It's not just about knowing words, it's about actually using them in a way that feels natural. This feedback perfectly frames the challenge that so many learners face, and it's what we're digging into today.
And get this, the scale of the problem was just staggering. The creator of this course, she thought most of her audience was intermediate or advanced, but it turns out that a full 25% of them said they were absolute beginners. That's not a small group. That is a huge, underserved audience just looking for a better way to get started.
So this is what we're calling the real English problem. It's that massive gap between knowing the rules of a language, all the grammar, the formal words, and actually having the confidence to use it in a normal, everyday chat. I think we've all been there, right? It can be so frustrating.
So, faced with this massive problem, a completely new approach was born. Instead of starting with boring, abstract rules, it just flips the whole thing around. It starts with the end goal, having a real conversation. Let's break down how this method actually works. And here it is. It's called the conversation breakdown method. It basically turns the traditional model on its head. You don't learn a bunch of rules and hope that one day you can have a conversation. No, you start with a real conversation and work backward from there to learn the rules in context. It's all about deconstruction.
The process is actually beautifully simple. It happens in 3 stages. First, the foundation. You just watch a natural conversation. Then, deconstruction. You start to peel back the layers of that chat to see how it's built. And finally, and this is so important, activation. You actually practice using what you've just learned. Let's see how these layers build on each other.
All right, now we're getting into the nuts and bolts, the actual proof of how this thing works. I mean, how do you go from watching a simple conversation about cleaning the house to being able to talk about it yourself? Well, the secret is all about learning in layers.
So layer 1 is pretty straightforward. It's all about vocabulary. But, and this is a big but, instead of some random list of words, every single term is pulled directly from the conversation you just watched. That immediately gives every single word a purpose and a place to live.
And this is the key, right? You're not just learning the word broom from a flashcard. You're learning it because you just saw someone in the video actually use a broom. You heard them talk about where the sheets and the comforter go. It's brilliant, because that context is what makes the words stick in your brain. Okay, next layer, grammar. And I know, for a lot of us, this is the part that gets a little scary. But in this method, grammar isn't taught as a bunch of rigid, complicated rules. It's actually presented as the simple glue that holds all that new vocabulary together.
And check this out, this is what I love about this method. It's so practical. A textbook might give you a dozen rules for prepositions. But here, the focus is on the little differences you hear in real life. Yeah, the food is on top of the high fridge, but the plates are just on the shelf. It's a tiny distinction, but it makes a huge difference in sounding natural.
Here's another perfect example. In and inside are both technically correct, but which one do people actually say more often? By pointing out that in is way more common in a normal conversation, the method guides you to sound more like a native speaker, not just like a textbook.
All right, the final piece of the deconstruction puzzle is pronunciation. And the goal here isn't some perfect, unattainable accent. It's about sounding natural and being understood. And one of the biggest keys to sounding less like a robot and more like a real person is mastering contractions.
I mean, just look at this. Saying you are is totally fine, but your is how people actually talk. The same goes for won't, it's, and don't. By teaching these shortcuts explicitly, the method closes that gap between formal, written English and the real rhythm of how people speak.
Okay, so you've peeled back all the layers. You've got the words, the grammar, the pronunciation, all from one single conversation. But that's all just passive knowledge, right? The final and maybe most critical step is turning all that understanding into an active skill.
And this is where the magic happens. The student gets asked a direct question that forces them to use the new vocabulary, to apply the right grammar, and to form a whole sentence. They're not just watching anymore. They are actually speaking. All right, let's pull back for a second and look at the big picture here. Why is this whole layered, conversation first thing so incredibly effective for so many people? Let's break down the key reasons it's so successful.
It really boils down to four main things. First, context is king. Everything you learn is tied to a real situation. Second, it's all about repetition. Rewatching and speaking out loud builds that muscle memory. Third, it demands you participate. You have to move from just listening to actually speaking. And finally, that whole journey builds an incredible amount of confidence.
But you know, it's not just about the method. There's another huge piece to this puzzle. As this student, Elaine, points out, you don't learn in a vacuum. That feeling of community, of practicing with other learners, that can be just as important as the lessons themselves. It keeps you motivated and makes the whole thing fun. And all of this really leaves us with one big question, doesn't it? What we've seen here is a method that's super practical, it's personal, and it's built around community. So it makes you wonder, is this the blueprint for how we're going to learn everything in the future? Is education itself becoming more practical, more personal, and more connected than ever before?